The Dark Ages, otherwise known as humanity's collective retardation. A time in European history where among the ruins of the great Roman Empire, the people devolved back to the Stone Age, collectively forgetting most of the Roman scientific advancements. Human rights are considered a bad joke, as all across the continent, witch burnings, torture sessions and executions attract massive crowds. The church is everywhere, the earth is flat, and everybody who says otherwise is a heretic. Truly a time where humanity just kinda went monkey mode for like 5 centuries until people once again started seeing the light with the Renaissance. Hey, nice straw man, Pepe. Why thank you. Now stand back as I meticulously deconstruct all these presumably widely held beliefs. But first, let me emphasize that this video is mostly focused on misconceptions about Western Europe. If you wanted an in-depth video on medieval Pakistan or something, that's just not what this is. So there's this idea that after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the people of Europe just kinda went back to banging rocks together. This is true, but only in a very limited sense. Because there definitely was a multi-century long age of civilizational decline. It just wasn't fully medieval. Now please get your torches and pitchforks ready, because I'm about to shit all over the decaying corpse of the Roman Empire. The fall of Rome in the late 5th century was a symptom rather than the cause of the Dark Ages, because those Dark Ages had already started 2 centuries prior to the Gothic redecoration of the empire's capital. What was the cause? Well, there wasn't just 1, or 2, or 3, or even 10. Just about anything that could go wrong for the Western Roman Empire went wrong. Their luck was so bad, it was like throwing dice and somehow managing to score a -3. I'm not gonna mention all of them since that would take way too long, but to give you an idea, some of these major causes were constant civil wars, hyperinflation, a disastrous shift in climate causing a very significant reduction in agricultural output, which, combined with several plagues, shrunk the population of the empire by about 20% and started the trend of deurbanization. The mass adoption of Christianity didn't exactly stabilize stuff either, and then there was the East-West split of the empire. A split that was amazing for the East, but absolutely catastrophic for the West. Because the East was the cultural and economic heart of the empire, while the West was essentially a backwater. And with a flick of a dick and a stroke of a pen, the West lost access to a lot of wealth, food, and knowledge. It's as if the US broke up into 2 different countries, with one half consisting of states like California, Texas, and New York, and the other half just being the Midwestern flyover states, with Washington DC as its capital. Also, quick side tangent. I hate how people keep drawing parallels between the fall of Rome and the current situation in the United States, when these situations just couldn't be more different. I mean, Rome's fall was caused by a large combination of factors like very high inflation, pandemics, corruption, slowdown of trade, mass migration, climate change, incompetent leadership. Wait a second. Anyway, this civilizational decline started in the 3rd century and would continue until the 7th century. But even in this era, people didn't necessarily go back to banging rocks together. Well, yeah, a lot of Roman stuff fell into disrepair. This wasn't because the barely sentient bone-brained beastly barbarians that roamed the land were incapable of comprehending what a road was. No, due to the collapse of the empire, a lot of Roman things simply weren't needed anymore. Case in point, the early medieval Netherlands. A Pepe the History video featuring Dutch history, you can cross that one off your bingo card, because in the early medieval Netherlands, a lot of Roman infrastructure, most prominently the Roman road network, was just left to rot. But why? Doesn't more infrastructure equal more better? Well, not if you can do most of your trade and travel on rivers. Rivers that are absolutely fucking everywhere, and are, most importantly, free. And if you know Dutch people as well as I do, they collectively cream their pants the moment somebody utters the word free. But yeah, thanks to the rivers, the early medieval Netherlands grew into a major trade hub, with cities like Dorestad growing into the tens of thousands, establishing trade relations all over the continent and becoming rich to the point their coins were among the most commonly found coins of the era, only second to those of the court of Charlemagne. And all of that without the Roman road network. Speaking of Charlemagne, if I could marry any historical figure, it'd be Cleopatra, obviously. But if she isn't interested in me because I'm not one of the most powerful people in the Roman Empire, then I'd probably pick Charlemagne. Why? I mean, obviously those things would make anyone an instant smash. But there's more to him and his legacy than the size of his elephant's trunk. Because his rule didn't just result in the existence of France and not France, it also started a true renaissance, with his most prominent figure being Alquin of York, who was basically Charlemagne's Minister of Education and probably the most influential person you've never heard of. Say viewer, do you hate school? If your answer was yes, then you're gonna absolutely despise this guy. Because a lot of our modern education system can be directly traced back to him. Stuff like classrooms, homework, beatings, etc. But that's not the only thing Alquin did. You see, it's easy to kill a man, impossible to kill an idea, but apparently you can kill a language. Because that's exactly what Alquin and the others at Charlemagne's court did. These nerds with terrible haircuts are the entire reason Latin is a dead language. So why and how the hell did they do that? Well, ever since the fall of Rome, Latin had been the language of science, meaning that both books and scientific discourse were in Latin. Nothing wrong with that, right? Actually, yes, because over time, dialects form. Dialects which in turn evolve into languages. During the time of Charlemagne, the Romance languages hadn't yet diverted enough to be mutually unintelligible. But the process was happening. So what's the solution? Basically the real-world equivalent of trying to win a science victory in a Civ game, plopping down as many schools as you can. And these schools taught, among other things, Latin. But not just any Latin, standardized Latin, which is very similar to regular Roman Latin, but with updated grammar and rules for inventing new words. But the biggest difference between Roman and standardized Latin wasn't written.
It's spoken.
Because the entire established pronunciation of Latin words was promptly defenestrated and replaced with the most robotic pronunciation possible. This turned standardized Latin into a lingua franca in Europe. A lingua franca for the rich and powerful, that is. Commoners obviously didn't have access to these schools. So, contrary to popular belief, church stuff being exclusively in Latin was just a side effect of this, rather than some sinister ploy to keep the illiterate peasants from understanding the true meaning of biblical texts so that the church could exploit them by saying one could buy their loved ones out of the fires of purgatory. That came later. Anyway, in the next couple of centuries, some of these schools would turn into the first universities. However, there are some key differences between modern universities and those of the Middle Ages. In the early days, there was no campus. Liberal arts included astronomy and geometry, and the Free Palestine protesters were referring to freeing Palestine from Muslim rule. But other than that, these medieval universities are very similar to the ones we know today. Students had to study 3 to 4 years for a bachelor's and another 3 years for a master's degree, after which they could choose to continue studying and doing research to get a doctorate in either law, medicine, or theology. More subjects would be added in the following centuries. Another medieval university thing that might sound familiar is people complaining about students constantly getting shit-faced and being a general fucking nuisance while simultaneously neglecting their studies. Some things just never change. Though I have to emphasize one thing. Medieval universities were very Christian, and that's reflected in everything. What was and wasn't included in the curriculum was done with the goals of the church in mind. But when those goals essentially come down to help people and worship God, that leaves a lot of room for new subjects. I mean, medicine helps people. Law is essential for social stability, which falls under helping people, and I'd reckon building a Gothic cathedral counts as worship. But you can't do that without a boatload of math. Even astronomy is extremely useful for determining the exact date of Easter. The church really wasn't as anti-science as people nowadays think. In fact, non-Christian texts were used and copied very often, and not just the old ones from Greece and Rome, but also newer Arabic ones. In fact, the scientific ideology of these universities was called empiricism, basically supporting the Catholic cause through secular study. And these secular studies did very much resemble our modern scientific process, being repeating cycles of observation, hypothesis, and experimentation. Anyway, another thing that improved during the Middle Ages is human rights. Pepe, what the actual fuck are you talking about? I'm glad you asked, imaginary storytelling device. Despite what popular depiction and tourist-trap museums all across Europe might tell you, torture, gruesome executions, and witch burnings really weren't as common as you'd think. In fact, a lot of famous medieval torture devices most likely never existed. Case in point, the Iron Maiden. I'm of course not talking about the band Iron Maiden. They're as real as it gets. No, I'm talking about these types of man-sized cabinets with spikes on the inside. Very gruesome indeed. You shove a guy in, close the door, open it, and voila, instant shish kebab. However, these things were never mentioned anywhere until the late 18th century, when some German philosopher claimed that the Iron Maiden was used in 1515 to execute a coin forger. But that doesn't necessarily prove it's fake. What does prove it's fake is the same philosopher later stating that he may have made the entire thing up. Another quote-unquote medieval torture device that's most likely fake is the good old Pear of Anguish. You can probably guess what it does, but if for whatever reason you're not tortured by your own vivid imagination, let me just state it like this. Remember when prior to Avengers Endgame, Marvel fans speculated that Ant-Man could defeat Thanos by crawling up his juicy purple ass? Well, the Pear of Anguish basically works in the same manner. Just pick an orifice, insert pear, and watch the unwilling participant cry in anguish as the pear slowly expands. But no, these things most likely never existed. Just like with the Iron Maiden, the earliest mention of the Pear of Anguish is from the late 18th century. There are some other medieval torture devices that later turn out to be 18th and 19th century inventions, but I think I've made my point. However, just because these things turned out to be fake, that doesn't mean none of them were real. Torture and gruesome executions did happen all over the continent. But that was for a very grim, but actually pretty solid reason. You see, things like detectives, forensic evidence, and cars that go wee-woo are modern luxuries that law enforcement of the medieval era simply didn't have access to. If you committed a crime without any witnesses, congratulations, you just got away with it. The chances of getting caught were so low that fighting and punishing crime the same way we do right now just simply wasn't possible, which is why a strong deterrent was the only real alternative. Basically, if you were caught committing a crime, your punishment would be very severe and very public. Not every crime had a death penalty though. For most petty crimes, the punishment was usually some form of public humiliation, like being dragged around town while tied to the cuck chair. Yes, that's the actual name. That being said, anything from theft to forgery to murder to having had a penis in your ass to having had a penis in someone else's ass, regardless of gender, carried the death penalty. But when the punishment for basically all crime is death, what's stopping you from essentially committing murder in accessory to loitering? That's why the worse your crime, the worse your execution. For something like theft, you'd either get a bit of the top or a short drop and a sudden stop. Not a terrible way to go, all things considered. Just poof, lights out. Compare that to what people guilty of more serious crimes had to go through. I'm not going to get into any details here, but let's just say that those unfortunate souls got a very interactive lesson on their own anatomy. Now, I'm not one for whataboutism, but why the fuck are people always focusing on medieval torture when the Romans were way worse? And I really mean way worse. In ancient Rome, slaves weren't people. And how can something that isn't a person testify in court? Oh, I know. What if we torture these slaves? Then they'll definitely tell the truth. For a slave to testify in court, they had to be tortured first. And not just if they were the defendant, also if they were witness to a crime. Your Honor, this slave said he saw everything. He knows who murdered Claudius. Interesting. But I don't know if we can trust him. Has the slave been in unimaginable pain yet? Compared to Rome, the medieval era was much better. Sources suggest that especially during the early medieval era, torture was very rare, and while it was more prevalent during the High and Late Middle Ages, there were often very strict rules surrounding the use of torture. It was mostly used when there was very strong evidence of guilt, but not enough evidence for conviction. It was also used in case of treason, or when the suspect was a known repeat offender. Contrary to popular belief, the medieval Catholic Church weren't a bunch of mustache-twirling Saturday morning cartoon villains. That doesn't mean they're saints either. It's just not as black or white as people make it out to be. Because it was thanks to efforts from the Catholic Church that slavery was abolished across medieval Europe. But that only applied to Christians. If you weren't Christian, your chances of being sold on the Balkan slave market were significantly higher. While slavery itself was abolished, it was replaced by serfdom, which wasn't slavery because they used a different word. The church also tried to ban the crossbow, viewing it as an inhumane weapon. Everybody ignored it, but still, A for effort. Another uphill battle the church fought was that against witch burnings, with their position essentially being, yes, witches do exist, but they're rarer than a Pepe the History Penguin viewer that isn't a virgin. So no, that old lady from your village that likes to pick mushrooms and who you keep blaming for the bad weather isn't a witch, so pretty fucking please, don't burn that poor woman to a crisp. How many times do I have to tell you? Anyway, the point of this video wasn't to claim the medieval era was somehow better than other eras of history, nor was it to discredit those who came before or after. In essence, the medieval era was just like all others. While some would go on to carve their names in history, most people were just that. People, facing many of the same joys and hardships we face today. Sure, technology and society have both progressed in major ways, and luckily the modern era hasn't had an outbreak of the Black Death yet. But still, whenever you read a history book, try to keep in mind that the people you read about are people. As they were, we are. And with that, I want to thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and make a sacrifice to the Dark Lord Cthulhu.